The stone walls of the German Wehrmacht garrison in the small Norman town of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont could not muffle the sound of American artillery growing closer with each passing hour. Marguerite Dubois pressed her face against the iron bars of her cell window, watching columns of smoke rise from the direction of Utah Beach, where she knew Allied forces had landed 3 days earlier, on June 9, 1944. At 28, Marguerite had been imprisoned for 2 weeks on charges of collaboration with enemy forces, accusations that carried the death penalty under German military law, but were based on evidence so complex and contradictory that even her captors seemed uncertain about her actual guilt or innocence. The sound of American voices in the courtyard below made her heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. Liberation by Allied forces should have meant freedom and vindication, but Marguerite understood that her situation was far more complicated than the simple categories of resistance and collaboration that usually defined wartime loyalties. La Française doit comparaître, she heard a German officer announce to someone in the corridor outside her cell. The Frenchwoman must appear. The formal language suggested that her case was being transferred from German to American authority, but Marguerite had no idea whether Allied forces would view her as a victim to be rescued or a collaborator to be punished. Marguerite's imprisonment had resulted from her work as a translator and cultural liaison between German occupation forces and the French civilian population of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Her fluency in German, English, and French had made her valuable to German administrators who needed to communicate with local officials about food distribution, labor conscription, and security matters. But what German authorities didn't know, and what French resistance fighters suspected but couldn't prove, was that Marguerite's position had allowed her to provide crucial intelligence to Allied agents while simultaneously protecting French civilians from the worst aspects of German occupation policies. For 18 months, she had walked a dangerous tightrope between competing loyalties, using her access to German planning documents to warn French families about impending roundups, while carefully crafting translations that softened German demands and created bureaucratic delays that saved lives. The approaching liberation had exposed her to danger from multiple directions. German officers suspected that intelligence leaks might be traced to personnel with access to sensitive documents, while French resistance members viewed anyone who worked closely with German authorities as a potential collaborator deserving of punishment. Mademoiselle Dubois called Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the German administrative officer who had been responsible for her case. American forces have requested custody of all French civilians currently detained on collaboration charges. You will be transferred to Allied authority within the hour. The announcement brought relief that her German captivity was ending, but also anxiety about how American forces would evaluate her complex wartime activities. Would they recognize her intelligence work for Allied agents, or would they see only a French civilian who had worked closely with German occupation authorities? Marguerite gathered her few possessions, a worn leather journal where she had carefully recorded her resistance activities in a code known only to British intelligence, a silver cross that had belonged to her grandmother, and the faded photograph of her brother Henri, who had been killed fighting with the resistance in 1943. The journal contained evidence that could vindicate her as a valuable Allied intelligence source, but it also documented activities that could be interpreted as collaboration if readers didn't understand the coded references to her work protecting French civilians and gathering information for British agents. As German guards escorted her through the garrison's stone corridors toward the main courtyard where American soldiers waited, Marguerite reflected on the choices that had led to this moment. Every decision during 18 months of occupation had involved moral complexity that defied simple categories of right and wrong. Her work with German authorities had saved French lives by providing early warnings about deportations and labor conscriptions, but it had also made her appear to be a collaborator to French patriots who didn't understand her true activities. The intelligence she provided to Allied agents had helped plan the D-Day invasion, but it had required maintaining relationships with German officers that looked like friendship or romantic involvement. The courtyard of the Wehrmacht garrison was bustling with American soldiers, processing German prisoners and civilian detainees. Marguerite could see Allied flags flying from buildings that had displayed German insignia just hours earlier. But the rapid transition from occupation to liberation created uncertainty about how the complex cases of wartime collaboration would be handled. The captured Frenchwoman must appear. announced Staff Sergeant Robert Murphy to his assembled squad, using English that Marguerite understood perfectly, but that sounded ominous in its formal military terminology. The phrase struck terror into Marguerite's heart, because it suggested that her case had attracted specific attention from American command authorities. In a situation where most civilian detainees were being processed routinely, special attention usually meant serious accusations that required careful investigation. Marguerite had heard stories about the treatment of suspected collaborators in other liberated French towns, public humiliation, beatings, and summary executions carried out by angry crowds seeking revenge for years of occupation and suffering. The fact that American soldiers were specifically requesting her appearance suggested that her case involved accusations serious enough to warrant military attention. As she was escorted across the courtyard by American military police, Marguerite noticed the expressions of soldiers and officers who observed her passage. Some showed professional neutrality appropriate for handling prisoners, while others displayed curiosity, or what might have been sympathy for a young Frenchwoman caught in circumstances beyond her control. The American command post had been established in the same building where Marguerite had once worked as a translator for German administrators. The irony of returning to translate for different occupying forces was not lost on her, but she wondered whether American officers would view her linguistic skills as valuable assets or evidence of suspicious collaboration with previous authorities. Mademoiselle Dubois, called Captain William Harrison, an American intelligence officer whose fluent French suggested sophisticated preparation for dealing with the complex loyalties of liberated French civilians. Please be seated. We need to discuss your activities during the German occupation. Marguerite took the offered chair, trying to maintain dignity despite her awareness that her appearance, after 2 weeks in German custody, probably made her look like exactly the kind of desperate collaborator that Allied forces were trained to suspect and investigate. Captain Harrison opened a thick folder that obviously contained detailed intelligence about her wartime activities, suggesting that American authorities had been gathering information about her case long before her actual liberation. The extent of their knowledge would determine whether her explanation would be believed or dismissed as self-serving lies. We have some interesting reports about your work during the occupation, Harrison continued, his tone neutral but not hostile. Before we discuss those reports, I want to give you an opportunity to explain your activities in your own words. The invitation to tell her own story was more consideration than Marguerite had expected, but she understood that her explanation would be evaluated against intelligence that American forces had already gathered from other sources. Her credibility would depend on consistency between her account and facts that Allied agents had independently verified. Marguerite took a deep breath, preparing to explain 18 months of moral complexity that had involved constant danger and impossible choices between competing loyalties and values. Her survival and reputation now depended on her ability to convey the truth about activities that had been designed to appear false to German authorities. The moment of judgment had arrived, and Marguerite would discover whether American liberation meant vindication for her resistance work or punishment for activities that had appeared to be collaboration with enemy forces. Captain Harrison studied Marguerite with the careful attention of an intelligence officer trained to detect deception, but his expression showed professional interest rather than the hostility she had expected from Allied authorities investigating collaboration charges. The office around them, formerly used by German administrators, was now decorated with American flags and maps showing Allied advances across Normandy. Mademoiselle Dubois, Harrison began, consulting documents that obviously contained detailed information about her wartime activities. Our records indicate that you served as translator and cultural liaison for German occupation forces from January 1943 until your arrest 2 weeks ago. That's 18 months of close cooperation with enemy authorities. Marguerite nodded, understanding that the basic facts of her collaboration were undeniable and that her only hope lay in explaining the motivations and secret activities that had guided her choices. Yes, Captain. I worked with German administrators because my position allowed me to protect French civilians and gather intelligence for Allied agents. Tell me about the intelligence work first, Harrison requested, his tone suggesting that American authorities already possessed information that could either confirm or contradict her claims about resistance activities. Marguerite reached for her leather journal, grateful that German guards had allowed her to keep the coded record of her intelligence activities. I maintained contact with British agent Philippe through dead drops in the Saint-Laurent church. My position gave me access to German transportation schedules, troop movements and security operations that I passed to Allied intelligence. Harrison examined the journal's coded entries with obvious familiarity, suggesting that American intelligence had access to British records that could verify her claims about cooperation with Allied agents. His recognition of the coding system indicated that her story was being evaluated against independent sources. Agent Philippe's real name was David Morrison, and he was exfiltrated through Spain in March 1944, Harrison confirmed, providing information that validated Marguerite's intelligence connections. His reports credited you with providing information that helped save Allied aircrews and plan resistance operations. The confirmation of her intelligence work brought enormous relief, but Marguerite understood that collaboration charges often involved complex activities that couldn't be reduced to simple categories of resistance or betrayal. Her work with German authorities required explanation that went beyond intelligence gathering. "Captain," she continued carefully, "my translation work allowed me to protect French families from deportation and forced labor. I deliberately mistranslated German orders to create confusion and delays that gave people time to hide or escape." Harrison consulted additional documents, obviously comparing Marguerite's explanations with testimony from French civilians who had witnessed her activities during the occupation. "We have statements from several families who credit you with warning them about German raids and helping them avoid deportation to German labor camps." The testimonials from French families provided crucial evidence of Marguerite's protective activities, but she knew that collaboration investigations often focused on personal relationships with German personnel that could be interpreted as romantic or social collaboration rather than strategic necessity. "There is another matter we need to discuss," Harrison said, his tone becoming more serious as he approached what was obviously a sensitive aspect of her case. "Multiple witnesses report that you maintained social relationships with German officers, including attending social functions and being seen in apparently friendly conversations with occupation personnel." Marguerite felt her face flush with shame and anger as she confronted the most difficult aspect of her wartime activities: the personal relationships that had been essential for gathering intelligence but had made her appear to be romantically involved with enemy officers. "My relationship with Hauptmann Weber was strictly professional," she said firmly, though she knew that appearances had suggested otherwise to French civilians who had observed their interactions. "I cultivated his trust because he had access to information about German operations that saved French lives." Harrison's expression suggested understanding of the moral complexity involved in intelligence work that required maintaining deceptive relationships with enemy personnel. "Hauptmann Weber has been captured and is currently undergoing interrogation. His statements about your relationship might clarify the nature of your interactions." The prospect of Weber's testimony being used to evaluate her wartime activities created new anxiety for Marguerite, who wondered whether the German officer would confirm her intelligence motivations or describe their relationship in terms that suggested genuine collaboration. Sergeant Murphy, who had been taking notes during the interrogation, looked up from his documentation with a question that addressed the broader context of Marguerite's situation. "Ma'am, French resistance groups in this area have made accusations against you. How do you respond to charges from your own countrymen?" The question highlighted one of the most painful aspects of Marguerite's situation, that her secret resistance work had been so well concealed that French patriots viewed her as a collaborator deserving of punishment rather than recognition. "French resistance members didn't know about my intelligence work because secrecy was essential for protecting both Allied agents and French civilians," Marguerite explained, her voice carrying the frustration of someone whose sacrifices had been misunderstood by the people she had tried to protect. Harrison nodded, understanding that effective intelligence operations often required agents to appear disloyal to their own side in order to maintain credibility with enemy forces. "The resistance wasn't informed about your activities because knowledge of your intelligence work would have compromised your effectiveness and endangered your life." The explanation provided context for the accusations against Marguerite, but it also highlighted the personal cost of intelligence work that required agents to sacrifice their reputations and relationships for strategic advantages that could only be recognized after the war ended. Captain Harrison closed his files and looked directly at Marguerite with an expression that suggested his evaluation of her case was complete. Mademoiselle Dubois, based on our investigation and the testimony we've gathered, it appears that your activities during the occupation served Allied interests and protected French civilians. The preliminary vindication brought tears of relief to Marguerite's eyes, but she understood that official recognition of her resistance work would need to be communicated to French authorities and civilian populations who had been led to believe she was a collaborator. However, Harrison continued, there remains the question of how to address accusations from French civilians who witnessed your apparent cooperation with German authorities. Public perception of collaboration is often as damaging as actual collaboration. The observation reflected the political complexity of post-liberation France, where the appearance of collaboration could destroy reputations and endanger lives, regardless of the actual motivations that had guided wartime choices. Lieutenant Sarah Coleman, an American officer specializing in civil affairs, had been observing the interrogation and now offered her perspective on the challenges facing French civilians accused of collaboration. We're seeing similar cases throughout liberated areas, people whose resistance work was so secret that they appear to be collaborators to their own neighbors. Marguerite understood that her situation was part of a broader pattern affecting many French civilians whose wartime activities had involved moral complexity that couldn't be easily explained or understood by people who hadn't shared similar experiences. "What happens to me now?" Marguerite asked, uncertain whether American vindication would be sufficient to protect her from French accusations and possible revenge by resistance groups who still viewed her as a traitor. Captain Harrison consulted his notes before providing an answer that would define Marguerite's immediate future and potentially her long-term prospects for rebuilding her life in liberated France. "You'll be transferred to American custody while we complete our investigation and coordinate with French authorities about your case," he explained. "Your intelligence work for Allied agents will be documented and shared with appropriate French officials." The promise of documentation and official recognition provided hope that her reputation could be restored, but Marguerite knew that the process of rehabilitation would be long and difficult in a community where appearances had created lasting impressions about her wartime loyalties. As the interrogation concluded, and Marguerite prepared to be transferred to American custody, she reflected on the unexpected respect she had received from Allied authorities who had taken the time to understand the complexity of her wartime choices rather than simply accepting accusations from French civilians. 3 days after her transfer to American custody, Marguerite found herself in comfortable quarters at the Allied Administrative Headquarters in Bayeux, where she was serving as a translator and cultural advisor for American officers dealing with the complex aftermath of liberation. The work was similar to her wartime activities, but the moral context was entirely different. She was now helping Allied authorities understand French civilian needs rather than protecting French families from German policies. Mademoiselle Dubois, called Colonel James Mitchell, the senior American officer responsible for civil affairs in the liberated region, "We've received some interesting information about your wartime activities that I'd like to discuss with you." Marguerite approached Colonel Mitchell's desk with the cautious optimism of someone whose situation had improved dramatically, but who remained uncertain about long-term prospects for rehabilitation and acceptance by French society. "We've been in communication with British intelligence regarding your work with Agent Morrison," Mitchell explained, consulting cables that had arrived from London during the morning briefing. "Their records provide detailed confirmation of the intelligence you provided and its contribution to Allied operations." The British confirmation represented official recognition of Marguerite's resistance activities, but she understood that documentation from Allied intelligence services might not carry sufficient weight to overcome local accusations of collaboration that were based on 18 months of apparent cooperation with German authorities. "Colonel," Marguerite said carefully, "I appreciate Allied recognition of my intelligence work, but French civilians in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont still believe I was a collaborator. Official vindication may not be enough to change public opinion about my wartime activities." Mitchell nodded, understanding that post-liberation reconciliation involved not just legal vindication, but social rehabilitation that required careful management of community perceptions and relationships that had been damaged by wartime suspicions. Captain Harrison entered the office carrying additional files that obviously contained new information about Marguerite's case. "Colonel, we've completed interrogations of captured German personnel who worked with Mademoiselle Dubois during the occupation. Their testimony provides interesting insights into her actual activities." The German testimony represented potentially crucial evidence about Marguerite's wartime behavior, but it also created the ironic situation where enemy personnel might provide more accurate assessments of her resistance activities than French civilians who had observed her interactions with German authorities. Hauptmann Weber confirms that you consistently advocated for lenient treatment of French civilians and often provided translations that minimized the impact of German orders, Harrison reported while reading from interrogation transcripts. He also states that you showed no enthusiasm for German policies and appeared to be cooperating only under duress. The German officer's testimony validated Marguerite's claims about using her position to protect French civilians, but it also revealed that her deceptive activities had been more effective than she had realized. Weber's observations suggested that even German authorities had recognized her reluctant cooperation. More significantly, Harrison continued, Weber admits that he suspected you might be involved in intelligence activities, but chose not to investigate because he respected your humanitarian efforts to protect French families. The revelation that a German officer had suspected but chosen not to expose her intelligence work demonstrated the moral complexity that had characterized relationships between occupying forces and civilian populations throughout the war. Lieutenant Coleman brought additional documentation that addressed the broader question of how Marguerite's vindication would be communicated to French civilians who had accused her of collaboration. "We've prepared a detailed report for French provisional government authorities that documents her intelligence work and protective activities. The official report would provide French authorities with evidence needed to clear Marguerite's name, but the process of social rehabilitation would require more than bureaucratic vindication. Community acceptance would depend on understanding and forgiveness from neighbors who had formed judgments based on incomplete information. There's another development that may interest you," Colonel Mitchell said, consulting a message that had arrived from Allied Intelligence Headquarters. "Agent Morrison has requested permission to provide testimony on your behalf to French authorities. His statement would carry considerable weight with resistance leaders." The prospect of testimony from the British agent, whose life had been protected by Marguerite's intelligence work, offered hope for recognition from French resistance groups, who had previously viewed her as a collaborator rather than an ally. Marguerite felt overwhelmed by the accumulating evidence of her wartime resistance activities, but she also understood that vindication created obligations to help other French civilians who might be facing similar accusations based on the complex moral choices required for survival during occupation. "Colonel Mitchell," she said thoughtfully, "there are other French civilians in this region who helped Allied agents or protected Jewish families but appear to be collaborators to their neighbors. My experience suggests that many collaboration accusations are based on incomplete understanding of wartime activities." Mitchell leaned forward with obvious interest in Marguerite's assessment of broader collaboration issues affecting liberated French communities. "Can you identify specific cases where French civilians might be facing unjust accusations?" Marguerite consulted her memory of the complex relationships and activities she had observed during 18 months of working with both German authorities and French resistance networks. Her unique position had provided insights into the moral complexity that had characterized civilian life under occupation. Marie Leclerc, who owns the bakery near the church, appeared to be friendly with German soldiers because she was gathering information about troop movements for resistance fighters, Marguerite explained. Pierre Moreau, the postmaster, seemed to cooperate with German censorship, but was actually hiding messages for Allied agents in routine mail deliveries. Each case represented the kind of moral complexity that had characterized Marguerite's own situation. Activities that appeared to be collaboration, but were actually resistance work that required maintaining deceptive appearances to be effective. Captain Harrison took detailed notes about the individuals Marguerite had identified, understanding that her intelligence could help Allied authorities distinguish between actual collaborators and resistance fighters whose activities had been necessarily secretive. Your insights could help us avoid punishing people who were actually helping Allied cause, Harrison observed. Many collaboration accusations are based on appearances rather than actual activities or motivations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Father Michel Rousseau, the elderly priest from Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, who had served as an informal mediator between German authorities and French civilians during the occupation. His presence suggested that community leaders were beginning to reconsider their assessments of Marguerite's wartime activities. Mademoiselle Dubois, Father Rousseau said warmly, speaking in French that reflected both relief and admiration, I have spoken with American officers about your work during the occupation. I want to apologize for doubting your loyalty to France. The priest's acknowledgement represented the beginning of social rehabilitation that was as important as official vindication for Marguerite's long-term prospects in French society. Community acceptance would depend on similar recognition from other local leaders who had influence over public opinion. Father, Marguerite replied, you had no way of knowing about my secret activities. I appeared to be collaborating because secrecy was necessary for protecting people and gathering intelligence. Father Rousseau nodded, understanding that effective resistance work often required activities that appeared treasonous to maintain credibility with enemy forces. American officers have shown me evidence of your intelligence work and your efforts to protect French families. I will share this information with other community leaders. The promise of community education about her actual wartime activities offered hope that Marguerite's reputation could be restored through patient explanation of the moral complexity that had guided her choices during the occupation. As evening approached, and Marguerite reflected on 3 days of unexpected vindication and growing recognition of her resistance activities, she understood that her experience represented broader themes about the difficulty of making moral judgments about wartime behavior without understanding the full context of people's choices and motivations. The Frenchwoman who had feared shame when summoned by American soldiers had instead found respect, understanding, and official recognition of activities that had served Allied interests while protecting French civilians from the worst aspects of German occupation policies. 2 weeks after her vindication by American authorities, Marguerite stood in the town square of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, where a public ceremony was being held to recognize French civilians who had provided assistance to Allied forces during the German occupation. The morning sun illuminated American and French flags flying together from the medieval church tower where she had once left coded messages for British agents. Citizens of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, announced Major Pierre Dubois of the French Forces of the Interior, using a microphone that carried his words across the square where German officers had once conducted roll calls and issued occupation decrees. We are here to honor French patriots whose secret resistance work has only now been revealed. Marguerite felt nervous as she prepared to receive public recognition that would reverse 18 months of community suspicion and restore her reputation among neighbors who had viewed her as a collaborator rather than a resistance fighter. Colonel Mitchell stood beside the French major, holding documents that officially recorded Marguerite's intelligence work and protective activities for Allied authorities. His presence demonstrated American commitment to ensuring that her vindication was complete and publicly acknowledged. Mademoiselle Marguerite Dubois, Major Dubois announced, his voice carrying the formal dignity appropriate for recognizing courage that had been hidden by necessity but had served French liberation, served as an intelligence agent for British forces while maintaining a cover position as translator for German occupation authorities. The crowd of several hundred French civilians listened with obvious surprise as details of Marguerite's secret activities were revealed for the first time. Many had observed her apparent cooperation with German authorities, but had never suspected that her collaboration was actually resistance work designed to protect French lives and aid Allied operations. Her intelligence reports contributed to the successful planning of Allied invasion operations, Major Dubois continued, reading from British intelligence files that documented Marguerite's contribution to Operation Overlord. Her warnings saved dozens of French families from deportation to German labor camps. Marie Leclerc, the baker who had also been vindicated as a resistance fighter rather than a collaborator, stood in the crowd with tears of relief streaming down her face. Her own recognition had been influenced by Marguerite's testimony about secret activities that had appeared to be collaboration with German forces. "I owe Mademoiselle Dubois an apology," called out Henri Moreau, a local farmer whose son had been hidden from German labor conscription based on Marguerite's early warning about roundup operations. "She saved my family, and I accused her of betraying France." The public acknowledgement of error represented the kind of community reconciliation that was essential for post-war healing, but it also highlighted the moral complexity that had made accurate judgments impossible during the occupation period. Father Rousseau had worked closely with American and French authorities to prepare the community for revelations about resistance activities that had been necessarily secret during the occupation. His theological framework emphasized forgiveness and understanding for both hidden resistance work and honest mistakes in judgment. "We have learned that many people who appeared to be collaborators were actually risking their lives to help Allied forces and protect French civilians," the priest had explained during Sunday sermons that prepared parishioners for revisions of their wartime assessments. Captain Harrison observed the ceremony with satisfaction, understanding that Marguerite's public vindication represented successful American handling of the complex collaboration issues that had emerged throughout liberated France. Her case had become a model for evaluating other accusations that might be based on incomplete understanding of wartime activities. "Agent Morrison sends his congratulations and gratitude for your service to Allied intelligence," Harrison told Marguerite as she received her official recognition. "He credits your information with saving Allied lives and contributing to the success of liberation operations." The message from the British agent, whose identity had been protected by Marguerite's intelligence work, provided personal validation that complemented official recognition from military authorities and growing community acceptance of her resistance activities. Lieutenant Coleman had been documenting the rehabilitation process as part of American research into post-liberation reconciliation challenges. "Your case has helped us develop better procedures for evaluating collaboration accusations throughout liberated territories," she informed Marguerite. The broader impact of Marguerite's vindication extended beyond her personal situation to influence Allied policies for handling the complex moral issues that emerged when communities attempted to assess wartime loyalties based on incomplete information about secret activities. Dr. Jean-Baptiste, the town's elderly physician who had quietly supported resistance activities while maintaining necessary professional relationships with German authorities, approached Marguerite with his own expression of respect and reconciliation. "Marguerite," he said quietly, using her first name to indicate personal friendship rather than formal acknowledgement, "your courage exceeded anything the rest of us accomplished during the occupation. You risked everything to protect people who suspected your loyalty." The recognition from Dr. Baptiste was particularly meaningful because his own wartime activities had involved similar moral complexity that required maintaining professional relationships with German personnel while secretly supporting resistance operations. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marguerite found herself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to express personal gratitude for protection they had received through her warnings about German operations. Each conversation represented a small step toward community healing and reconciliation. "Mademoiselle," said Claudette Moreau, a young woman whose brother had escaped labor deportation based on Marguerite's intelligence, "I want to thank you for saving Paul's life, and I want to apologize for the things I said about you during the occupation." The personal apologies were both gratifying and painful for Marguerite, who understood that community suspicion had been based on reasonable assessments of available evidence rather than malicious intent to destroy her reputation. "Claudette," Marguerite replied gently, "you couldn't have known about my secret work. I appeared to be collaborating because effectiveness required maintaining that appearance. No apology is necessary." The gracious response to community misjudgment demonstrated the emotional maturity that had allowed Marguerite to endure 18 months of moral isolation while continuing her dangerous resistance activities. Colonel Mitchell prepared to leave Sainte-Marie-du-Mont for other duties, but his final conversation with Marguerite addressed the broader lessons that her case had provided for Allied understanding of French society and post-liberation challenges. "Your experience has taught us that resistance and collaboration are not always easily distinguished," Mitchell observed. Effective resistance work sometimes required activities that appeared to be betrayal but actually served Allied interests. The assessment reflected growing American appreciation for the moral complexity that had characterized civilian life under occupation, where survival and effective resistance often required moral choices that defied simple categories of loyalty and betrayal. As Marguerite returned to her reconstructed life in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, she carried with her the knowledge that her experience represented broader themes about the difficulty of making accurate moral judgments during wartime and the importance of seeking truth rather than accepting appearances. The Frenchwoman who had feared shame when American soldiers demanded her appearance had instead found respect, vindication, and ultimately restoration of honor that validated her wartime choices and demonstrated that moral courage could be recognized even when it had been hidden by necessity. Her story became part of the historical record of French resistance activities, proving that some of the most effective opposition to German occupation had come from people who appeared to be collaborators, but were actually risking everything to protect their countrymen and aid Allied victory. The unexpected respect she had received from American liberators had led to community reconciliation that healed wartime divisions and demonstrated that truth could overcome appearances when people were willing to acknowledge the complexity of moral choices made under impossible circumstances. If this powerful story of hidden courage finally receiving recognition moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these incredible stories that prove heroism often wears the mask of betrayal to protect those it serves. We're passionate about uncovering these forgotten tales, where moral complexity defied simple categories of loyalty and collaboration, showing how some of the bravest resistance fighters had to appear to be traitors to be effective. These stories remind us that true courage sometimes requires sacrificing one's reputation to serve a greater cause. What struck you most about Marguerite's transformation from suspected collaborator to recognized hero? Her 18 months of secret intelligence work, while appearing to collaborate with Germans, the American officer's careful investigation that revealed the truth, or perhaps the community's willingness to acknowledge their misjudgment and embrace reconciliation. And here's something profound to consider. In our own lives, how often do we judge others based on appearances without understanding the full context of their choices and circumstances? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories of hidden heroism inspire you and what lessons they might hold for looking beyond surface appearances to understand the true motivations behind people's actions in our own communities today.